Chapter review. This chapter describes the uses of real GDP and explains its limitation as a measure of the standard of living. The standard of living is the level of the consumption of the goods and services that people enjoy. Average income per person determines standard of living, so real GDP per person is used to compare the standard of living over time or across nations. Real GDP fluctuates around potential GDP in a business cycle, going from an expansion to a peak to a recession to a trough. Potential GDP is the value of real GDP when all factors of production are fully employed. A recession is commonly defined as a time when real GDP decreases for at least two successive quarters. Real GDP per person is an imperfect measure of the standard of living because it excludes household production, underground production, the value of leisure time, environmental quality, health and life expectancy, and political freedom and justice. Practice problems. What is the relationship between real GDP and potential GDP? Potential GDP is the value of real GDP when all factors are fully employed. Over time, potential GDP grows. Real GDP fluctuates around the growth path of the potential GDP. These fluctuations reflect the business cycle. If you cook a hamburger at home, what happens to GDP? If you go to Burger King and purchase a hamburger, what happens to GDP? If you cook a hamburger at home, it is not counted in the calculation of GDP because hamburger is a household production. If you go to Burger King and purchase a hamburger, the production of hamburger is counted in the calculation of GDP. What are the parts of a business cycle? What is their order? The business cycle is made up of the expansion phase, when real GDP is growing, the peak when real GDP reaches its highest level, the recession phase when real GDP is falling for at least 6 months, and the trough when real GDP is at its lowest level. The order of the business cycle is from expansion to peak to recession to trough and then back to expansion. What general categories of goods and services are omitted from GDP? Why is each omitted? Goods and services omitted from GDP are household production, underground production, leisure time, and environmental quality. GDP measures the value of goods and services that are brought in markets. Even though underground production is frequently brought in markets, activity is unreported and is not included in GDP. These are true and false and multiple choice.